This episode may contain content that could be triggering for some viewers and listeners. I would suggest that you not watch or listen to this while in the presence of children. Please proceed with caution and take care of yourself. Jim Brown, the legendary running back for the Cleveland Browns, was one of the most dominant athletes of all time. In just 9 seasons, he rushed for 12,319 yards and 106 touchdowns, setting numerous NFL records. He was also a powerful advocate for social justice, and his activism helped to pave the way for other athletes to speak out on important issues. But Brown's life was not without its challenges. He had an extremely complicated love life marked by multiple marriages and many allegations of abuse. Perhaps this is one of the reasons why his love story has been requested many times since he passed away earlier in May. But to be honest, this part of Jim Brown's life was probably the most enigmatic. He was revered throughout his life as Superman, a man's man, and a womanizer. But the problematic parts of the latter are the reason why the former is how he's remembered. That plus his own clandestine approach to the allegations and charges. To genuinely reflect on that would strip away the magic of the man when he was just that, a man. As always, I'll tell you all about what I learned about Jim, his wives, fiancés, and girlfriends, just as the details were shared many years ago. Hey, all runners. As you know, this is I Will Tell You What, a weekly podcast where I share the weddings, marriages, and romances of Black figures throughout time. We bask on these relationships not to be messy, but to remind you of the passion in our past and to humanize the people we put on pedestals. Basically, it's all love, Black history. And I'm Ashley, your favorite raconteuse or storyteller that tells you these stories every single week. Welcome to the 23rd episode and the season 1 finale of I'll Tell You What, sort of. But we can talk about that later. When Jim Brown married his first wife, Sue Jones, he was in the second year with the Cleveland Browns. Then he was already the father of one, a daughter named Karen that he had with his high school sweetheart, Henrietta Creech. Henrietta's home was a safe place for Jim when he was growing up. He had a tumultuous relationship with his mom, partially because he felt like she was always choosing her boyfriends over him. They continued to date while he was a student at Syracuse, and that timing is when Henrietta got pregnant. He wrote in his autobiography, Out of Bounds, that, quote, Henrietta just started raising Karen by herself with the help of her parents. Jim, in his feelings a bit, wrote, quote, I'm not a man prone to regret, but I should have married Henrietta. After she had Karen, I knew she wanted to marry me, but she was so strong, she never harped on it. He did not marry Henrietta because he felt it would have hindered his aspirations. He wanted to finish school and become a professional athlete. He also wrote, quote, I felt I could not take on a wife and child. And yet, in 1959, he married Sue Jones at the age of 22. I'm not sure how they met, but Sue was described as petite and demure. She's the type of wife that prepared a hearty breakfast for Jim to enjoy during his 1964 interview with Ebony magazine. According to the biography, Jim Brown, The Fierce Life of an American Hero by Mike Freeman, he wrote, quote, she gardened and sewed. He'd get home around 3:30 and she would be waiting. They together became parents, having twins Kim and Kevin in 1960 and again in 1962 by having a son named James Jr. Like many women of that era, Sue gave the appearance of the perfect wife despite her marriage to Jim being anything but. She said that, quote, before we got married, he said there was always going to be other women. He said, you're never going to have a little picket fence. I'm Jim Brown. I can marry anybody in the world, and there are always going to be other women. Can you deal with that? And Sue said she could. Handling Jim's infidelities would be something she would have to face many, many times over the years. Jim Brown's affairs were not discreet. His coach knew, his teammates knew, and even his wife, Sue, knew. Biographer Dave Zirin of the book Jim Brown, Last Man Standing wrote Jim, quote, had a constant opportunities for sex outside of his marriage. Brown was not one to let those moments slip through his fingers, and still was not one to bring it up on the precious few days her husband made his way back home. Jim once said, quote, no matter how many other women I've been around with, I've never told them that I was unhappy or didn't love my wife. But the way Jim loved was not one of fairy tales and butterflies, but quite the opposite. His alleged and not so alleged indiscretions went beyond being seen with one of the various young women that he touted while out and about. Many of these played out in the news as various women would come forward with charges against him. Now, this is the part that makes his love story so complicated, because several of these incidents made the news, yet never made it to court due to drop charges. Like in March 1965, a former student from Ohio State alleged that Jim raped her. But that woman did not press charges, nor did the two 22-year-old women who accused Jim of, quote, beating and then throwing them down the stairs because, quote, they refused to perform a sex act together. But also in 1965, an 18-year-old Cleveland young lady named Brenda Ayers, quote, accused Brown of assault. This went to court where she testified that he, quote, slapped her around in a motel room on the night of June 19th and forced her to commit an unnatural sex act. To be specific, she said the 29-year-old fullback, quote, plied her with whiskey, slapped her face, hip, and stomach, and forced her to have sex relations with him on 2 occasions. Jim said, quote, I am not that small that I have to beat a girl, but alas, this would be one of those rare instances that would play out in court. It is important to note that the public sentiment of this ordeal was that Brenda was a liar. As she cried during the trial, journalists of the time wrote quizzically about her actions. Many Jet magazine articles referred to her as the, quote, high school dropout, as according to her mother, Brenda, quote, quit her 11th grade classes after meeting Jim. Perhaps this was the media's way of trying to discredit her. During the trial, Brenda admitted to Jim giving her money and meeting up with him in a motel room several times. She also said that he hit her on 2 different dates and was, quote, violently struck, kicked, and forced towards having unnatural relations with him. Jim testified, though he didn't have to, because he wanted to, quote, tell what really happened and clear his name. He said that he tried to convince her to return to school as requested by her mother. He also said he gave her $50 because Brenda told him she needed money for a, quote, dying uncle. He also testified that, quote, she wanted some money and said that she'd have some relations with me. I wouldn't buy that. Her mom, however, testified that when Brenda came home, quote, I noticed her darkened eyes and rushed her into the bedroom. I bathed her eyes and put alcohol on her bruised hip. She also said that her daughter told her, quote, Jim Brown beat me and left me at the motel. Brenda's friend, Paula White, a 16-year-old who was the daughter of the person who sorted Jim's mail and was the one who introduced her to Jim, testified as well. She said that Brenda came to her house after the night in question and that, quote, she said she had been to a lot of parties. She also said that Brenda alluded to her mom suggesting that she fabricate parts of the story so that they would, quote, have a chance for a civil suit. Paula mentioned that Brenda told her that she thought that they weren't going to win the case. And she was right, because 10 days later, the 7-woman, 5-man jury that consisted of 4 African Americans found Jim to be innocent. The following year, Brenda took Jim back to court, but this time in a paternity suit. A pregnant Brenda claimed that Jim was the father of her unborn child, but by the following summer, she lost that case too when the jury voted 11-1 that Jim was not the father of her daughter, Shelly Monique. However, over 2 decades later, Jim would publicly claim that Shelly was indeed his daughter. Through this entire ordeal, Sue stood beside him. Honestly, she accompanied him in court despite filing for divorce several times throughout the 1960s, and she would continue to do so until 1968. Sue Brown filed for divorce from the legendary Jim Brown many times. The first time was in 1962. The last was in 1968. This was after almost a decade of marriage where most of it was allegedly distant. The timing of when Sue filed in 1968 was right after another news-making scandal that allegedly included her husband. 3 years after 18-year-old Brenda Ayers took Jim to court over a sexual assault in which he was acquitted, in June of 1968, quote, he was arrested and charged with assault with intent to commit murder to his girlfriend, a 22-year-old Jamaican German model named Ava Bonin. Now, Jim and Ava met while he was in London filming The Dirty Dozen. When describing her to Ebony magazine in December of 1968, Jim said, quote, now here's a girl who speaks 4 or 5 languages. She's a cultured girl, a beautiful and charming girl, a girl I'm proud to be seen with anywhere. Man, I can walk into a party with her on my arm and all eyes turn. To say they had a conventional affair would be underselling the nature of their relationship. It's written that Jim and Ava would engage in threesomes and orgies with other women. But not only that, their relationship was described as, quote, volatile and even violent. He had retired from football and was pursuing his acting career and was very successful at it. And also, so it made sense for him to be mostly living in a condo in West Hollywood. In the summer of 1968, Jim and Ava allegedly got into what sounded like a very heated argument at his home. A neighbor, quote, heard screaming and what sounded like loud thuds. The cops were called. When they arrived, Jim initially refused to let them in. They tried again and one cop, quote, attempted to shove his way inside, but Jim hit him. Another officer arrived and eventually Jim let them in. The cops saw, quote, a 5-inch patch of hair in addition to, quote, blood on the rug, on the walls, on a towel, and on a bedspread. And when they found Ava, she was not hiding in the bathroom or underneath the bed or in a closet, but, quote, sprawled and barely conscious underneath the balcony, where the cops guessed she fell 20 feet. And when they found Ava, she was not hiding in a bathroom or underneath the bed or perhaps in a closet, but, quote, sprawled and barely conscious underneath the balcony, where the cops guessed she fell 20 feet. With his girlfriend almost lifeless on the ground below his second-story condo, Jim was arrested. But he denied throwing her. He said, quote, I did not throw her off that balcony. I was not accused of that. That was totally fabricated. It was a lie. He told Ebony magazine that because she was in the country, quote, on a foreign passport, when the cops were called, she tried to evade them by climbing out of the window and simply slipped. This incident left her with a separated shoulder and bruises all over her face. And yet, she didn't press charges. Quote, investigators were highly suspicious of her story, but there was nothing they could do. Jim was free, and they continued to date. And Ava's career took off because of this. She became known as, quote, Jim Brown's girl, which kept her booked and busy in modeling jobs even in the years to come. Journalist and feminist Gloria Steinem, Jim's other paramour of the time, allegedly, wrote about this event, saying it could, quote, spice up his screen image, give it an edge of real-life scariness. Ebony magazine profiled him in a piece that was published at the end of that year, where they described what happened to Ava as she, quote, jumped or fell or something. Essentially, all the horror of the story just added to the imagined myth of Jim Brown, while diminishing the seriousness of the allegations. So while Jim dealt with that, the beginning of a very lengthy divorce proceeding from wife Sue began. By 1972, so about 4 years later, the divorce was finalized, with Jim having to pay Sue $2,500 a month in alimony and $100 weekly for their children. He also transferred the title of their Cleveland home to her. Sue would move on and continue to raise her children without her ex-husband, and Jim would entertain marriage again. So as his marriage to his first wife, Sue, was coming to an end, Jim Brown told Ebony magazine, quote, I need a woman who is educated and charming and able to hold her own anywhere. She has to be the kind of woman who isn't happy with the way she was 10 years ago. She has to be the kind of woman who's constantly seeking to improve herself and improving herself in a way that's an asset to her man. 2 years after his divorce to wife Sue was finalized, he was engaged to marry again. But this time, the 37-year-old was preparing to spend his life with a quiet, petite Diane Staley, an 18-year-old Clark College student from Philadelphia. Their engagement was profiled in Jet magazine in 1974. When they met, he told Jet, quote, he had no intentions of getting married again. But while on vacation in Mexico, he was introduced to the young woman that would become his fiancée 8 months into their relationship. Then, Jim proposed with a, quote, diamond and emerald engagement ring. Her parents were, quote, pleased with their relationship, despite the many claims of Jim's alleged abuse. Her father, an attorney, said about Jim, quote, in my profession, we are taught never to prejudge an individual. In fact, if anything, her father was impressed with Jim, assuming that he would be stupid because he played football. Diane planned to transfer to UCLA after getting married since Jim lived in California. She had aspirations of becoming an attorney just like her father. Prioritizing completing undergrad was something that was not only important to her father, but to Jim as well. A marriage and that happy ending would not be in the cards for these two. By June 1974, Jet magazine would announce that their wedding was postponed. Diane's father claimed that it was because Jim was to film a movie in Spain around the time of their wedding. He also claimed that Diane and Jim were still engaged, but there wasn't much known about their relationship afterwards, so one can just assume it dissolved into the abyss. But as you can probably tell, Jim is never along for long. In the 1980s, one young woman that former Cleveland Brown running back Jim Brown dated was a 20-something named Deborah Clark. According to her autobiography, she worked at a gym, and one day when her shift ended, she decided to tan on the rooftop with her friend Lynn. Well, Lynn noticed that an older man was staring at Deborah. She didn't know who the man was and didn't think anything of it. Her friend told her that he was Jim Brown, an actor that used to play football. Deborah wrote, quote, he was an old man and not her type of guy she would usually date. She began to notice Jim more while she was at work. She felt like he was interested in her, but, quote, it just gave her the creeps. She wrote that it felt, quote, so lustful, like a hungry wolf circling his prey. Once she got off work, Jim was there and offered to take her home. He tried convincing her that he wouldn't kidnap her, but Deborah got on the bus anyway. When she got off the first bus to get on the connecting one, Jim was also there, waiting. Once she made it to her final stop, she wrote that Jim followed her as she walked towards her apartment. While this unnerved her some, she said she was, quote, intrigued by his persistence. Not too long after that, she noticed she was gaining weight and missed her cycle. Her friends speculated that she was pregnant, and she instantly thought of the last person she slept with, Eddie Murphy, allegedly. This concerned her because she wasn't ready to be anyone's mom yet. This escalated to an intense pain, which made her pass out, and when she came to, she heard Jim's voice insisting that she be taken to the hospital. Once she arrived, she learned that she actually wasn't pregnant at all. That relieved her, but also concerned her because what could this be? Why was she in so much pain? Well, she was dealing with something that a lot of women go through. She said, quote, I had a fibroid tumor that was the size of an orange, which blocked me from having my period and protruded my stomach. She had surgery almost immediately thanks to Jim. He also got her mother's contact information by reaching out to Deborah's boss and flew her out from Pittsburgh to Los Angeles. Once she was discharged, Jim decided that Deborah should recover at his place instead of her apartment with her two roommates. But to make her feel comfortable, he suggested that one of her roommates also stay at his home as well. While her mom was in town, Jim took them all to the Playboy Mansion as Hugh Hefner was one of his good friends. Once they got back home, Deborah's mom must have been feeling herself a little bit because she, quote, pushed up on Jim in front of the four of them. Deborah said Jim pushed her off of him and said, quote, I don't want you, I want your daughter. As awkward as that entire situation was, Deborah wasn't sure how she felt about Jim, but that would change after Jim defended her at a nightclub against her ex-boo, Eddie Murphy, when he alleged that she was trying to get money from him by pretending to be pregnant. Now, Jim told him that wasn't the case at all and, quote, for him to not worry about anything concerning her because she was now, quote, his woman. While the relationship between former football player and actor 50-year-old Jim Brown and his early 20-something girlfriend, Deborah Clark, had a very interesting beginning. Allegedly, it became violent over time. In her autobiography, she wrote about several of these occurrences. One time, allegedly, Jim and Deborah went to Sports Connection, the gym she used to work for when she met him. While Jim was playing racquetball, Deborah ran into actor Richard Lawson. She said he was excited about a new role on Dynasty he landed, so he was going around hugging and kissing everyone, including her. Jim saw this, and she knew that there would be a problem later. So that night, once Jim was gone off several drinks, allegedly, he asked her, quote, "Why did you let that N-word kiss you?" Then he threw his drink in her face. She then wrote, quote, "Before I knew it, he grabbed me by my hair and dragged me into his bedroom, all while I was screaming, punching, and kicking, trying to get him to let me go." She said he trapped her in his room and locked the door. She ran to the closet and grabbed his gun. She wrote, quote, "He launched at me and I pulled the trigger. The bullet hit the ceiling and Jim unlocked the door and ran out of the room and the house." Now, Deborah stayed inside the room, locked away, and called the cops. Doreen, someone who was staying in Jim's guest house, heard the gunshots and ran inside to see what happened. Deborah, visibly shaken up, walked outside with Doreen around the time the cops arrived. She said Jim screamed, quote, "Deborah, tell them that this was all a big mistake." After the officers took statements of everyone there, Jim was arrested and Deborah went to the hospital. By the time she got back to Jim's place, she packed up and decided to go to a motel. Once she was secure inside the room, the phone rang. It was Jim's cop friend, George. He asked Deborah to meet Jim at his home so they could talk privately. This was 1986, so Deborah wondered how he even knew where she was in the first place. George came to her motel room and drove her to his home. Allegedly, Jim apologized, and George and his wife suggested that she drop the charges since Jim's lawyer, Johnny Cochran, would win the case anyway. Deborah said, quote, "I had just had the man that I loved beat me, and now where do I put that love?" Deborah would compartmentalize her emotions as eventually she returned home with Jim. Now, that wouldn't be the only incident, according to Deborah. She wrote, quote, "He ran into a friend of mine, Mark DeBarge, and he told Jim to tell me hi. Later, Jim asked me, quote, if I wanted to be with that N-word," allegedly. Also allegedly, frustrated with that assumption, she began to walk away, and he tried stopping her from exiting the garage. She tried to run down the driveway to escape. She said, quote, "He caught up with me and grabbed hold of my legs, and I came down face first on the curb, knocking out 2 of her teeth and part of her gums. Blood was all over the walls, doors, everywhere. When she went to look at herself in the bathroom, she didn't recognize herself. Quote, I was swollen from my forehead to my chin and the blood was all over my face." Jim, quote, reached into his drawer and took out his gun. He was saying, quote, "Nobody would believe this was an accident and now I have to kill us both." Allegedly, he held her at gunpoint overnight until he grabbed a bag full of money and clothes and drove them to Santa Barbara. A few days later, he got her an after-hours dentist appointment where the dentist reinstalled her teeth in exchange for a lot of cash. And like the time before, Deborah and Jim would eventually return home together. Now, those moments would be offset by times like when Jim surprised Deborah around Christmas with a 14-karat gold diamond tennis bracelet and a trip to Hawaii. During the trip, he proposed with a diamond ring with one condition, allegedly, for them to get married during the vacation. Deborah, despite figuring out, quote, just how can a person who you love so much hurt you the most, said yes to Jim. They did not get married in Hawaii, however, because during a calm day at the beach, allegedly, Jim almost drowned while attempting to body surf. Deborah said he was reflective during the remainder of the trip in that, quote, he felt helpless against the ocean and how big the ocean was compared to him and how big in comparison he is to me. That scar left on his forehead would remind him to never put his hands on me again. She said he never actually apologized, but, quote, that was enough for me to know he felt convicted of it. Shortly after returning home, their relationship was coming to an end. Deborah had a dream where she felt like God gave her a sign to leave. The door to each other was still open until Deborah had her daughter Bianca, where she realized she loved her child more than she loved Jim. After Jim Brown's engagement to his ex-fiancée Deborah Clark ended, he would actually marry again. He met an attractive dark-skinned woman named Monique in the mid-1990s in Buffalo, New York, while they were both on a morning show. They began to date, and in 1997, Jim and Monique got married. By then, she was in her very early 20s, and he was in his early 60s. However, their marriage was described as, quote, fervent, at times scorching. The biggest news-making moment of their love story occurred in 1999. Based on numerous retellings of the event, Jim was more to himself and very quiet, and so Monique thought that these changes in his behavior were due to him having an affair. But instead, he was mourning the loss of his good friend and former LAPD investigator George, the one that helped Jim during his domestic ordeal with his ex-fiancée Deborah. He also had a meeting with Ohio officials regarding his rehabilitation economic development program called Can. And yet, quote, Monique continued her aggressive probing. They got into an argument that continued as Monique was trying to leave the home. Jim told her, quote, he was going to kill her by snapping her neck. Jim grabbed a shovel and began to slam it into the windows of the car repeatedly. Monique called 911 once she retreated with her dog to a neighbor's home and told the operator that, quote, he beat my car with the shovel, and that though there was a history of domestic violence, he did not hit her. This drew out 15 cop cars and over a dozen police officers to the home, and Jim was arrested. Mind you, this was a few years after the OJ situation. The resolution of this would drag out publicly over the next 5 years. Monique would say that she, quote, overreacted and was, quote, not thinking straight by calling 911. And in 1999, both Jim and Monique appeared on Larry King Live in what some called a PR stunt. She alluded to her reaction of the incident being due to having PMS. The unspoken sentiment around this was that Jim was a public figure that was very vocal about injustices, so this was the perfect opportunity for him to be targeted. The trial began in late August 1999, and on June 10th, the jury found Jim not guilty of terroristic threats towards Monique, but guilty of vandalism. In the following month, he was sentenced to community service. Quote, enroll in and complete a 12-month batterers program, comply with a modified protective order, pay $1,500 to a battered women's shelter, the victim is to be notified, and pay a $100 restitution fine and $200 to a domestic violence fund. Jim rejected this as he felt it was, quote, being spirited and vicious because he was not guilty for the threats or any sort of assault. So instead, he took the alternate consequence by serving 6 months in prison. When reflecting on this situation, Monique said, quote, it made me realize who my husband is, not who my husband is inside, but who he is to America. She also said she, quote, challenged him and, quote, she shouldn't have done that. And Jim said, quote, the issue isn't about the safety of women, it's about making a political point. Despite the event early in their marriage, Jim and Monique settled into domestic bliss, or at least domestic discretion. They would eventually have 2 children, Eris and Morgan, and Jim was finally the present father he was not to all of the other children he had previously. When reflecting on his relationship with his older kids, he said, quote, I have my regret, I could have been there more. Eventually, Monique became the president of his Can business, and last year they celebrated 25 years of marriage. Monique and Jim were committed to the work of Can, creating second chances and opportunities for at-risk and high-risk youth. The two made many public appearances throughout their marriage, and when Jim passed away earlier this year in May, she spoke at his celebration of life. When reflecting on his life and the life they shared, she said, quote, walking with Jim every day was an honor for me. Jim was my best friend. He was my biggest champion. He had trust in me. He respected me. He listened to me. It started where he was, my mentor, and as I gained wisdom and experience, he shifted and leaned on me more. So as you can see, Jim Brown's life and love stories were more complex than they were fascinating. You probably understand why this part of his life is not frequently discussed and how this makes him a polarizing figure. Some may see him as a flawed hero, while others may see him as a cautionary tale. But there is no doubt that he was one of the most influential athletes of his generation, and his legacy continues to be debated today. In the end, it is up to each individual to decide how you view him, but it would not be fair to revere him for certain parts of his life while ignoring the other pieces as well. To learn more about Jim Brown, as there has been so much written and documented about his life, I'd encourage you to read his autobiography, Out of Bounds, biographies Jim Brown, Last Man Standing by Dave Zirin, and Jim Brown, The Fierce Life of an American Hero by Mike Freeman. I would also suggest that you purchase Deborah Clark's autobiography. The links to these resources, plus others I used to prepare for this episode, will be included in the notes below and soon on the website. I hope you enjoyed this week's I'll Tell You What episode on Jim Brown. So tell me, what did you know? How did you feel? What are your thoughts around Jim Brown? I'm very curious. Please share in the comments. And also, don't forget to subscribe, follow, and leave a podcast review regardless of where you get your I'll Tell You What stories. Don't forget to check the links in the notes below. As always, if you want to support the show, by the end of the month, the Patreon will be launching, so stay tuned. And don't forget to follow us everywhere so you know how you can become an official All Runner. And thank you in advance if you do. But also, you can buy merch like this and others by going to I'llTell.com. All Runners, this episode will conclude the first season of I'll Tell You What. Honestly, with the holidays approaching, I want to take this time to rest, enjoy time with my family, but also read and prepare for season 2, which will drop in January. And that also includes finishing up the website and officially launching the Patreon. However, I am not going to leave you hanging because I want you to continue to enjoy I'll Tell You What with your family and friends this holiday season. So what I'm going to do is continue to share with you amazing love stories and even spin the block on a few of the stories from earlier in the year before I was deep in my research bag. Like, if you remember, I'll Tell You What, back when it was the Love, Wedding, and Marriage Black History series, like in February and March and early April of the year, yeah, you may know what I'm saying. But just know that you're going to enjoy it, so definitely come back. Again, follow everywhere, and y'all be safe this holidays. And friends, All Runners, I will see you all in the pews. Love.